St. John Fisher College. Oh, we got it. And yeah, so basically there's a lot of reasons I left academia to join sort of the nonprofit and nonprofit adjacent world. And I was just super pleased to see the opportunity to work at the Data Hub. As Vicki said, we don't get directly involved in the redistricting process ourselves. We essentially support organizations such as you all, individuals, journalists, researchers, really anybody who's passionate about fair redistricting and sort of identifying and stopping gerrymandering. We're here to support with the data because it is a very data complex issue. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. I believe these slides were passed around earlier, but I'd be happy to send them to anybody after the fact if you would like. And I'm just going to jump right into it because I think there's a lot to talk about. And if you all have questions, I want to make sure we have time for that. So just really quickly, as I was already giving you some information about the Data Hub, our website is redistrictingdatahub.org. I encourage you to go check it out if you haven't already. Obviously, our main focus is on the data, redistricting data. But we also operate a help desk, so you can send in redistricting questions. That's how I connected with you all. And we also host trainings, sort of like this one. All of our previous trainings have been recorded and are hosted on the website as well. And we also do research, sometimes things that we identify internally that we need to know about, but also sometimes prompted by questions that come in through the help desk. So as I said, we're always eager to get questions, and then we turn those into publicly available articles or online resources. So our goal is to make everything free, everything publicly available, to really try to support the public. All right, so that's enough about the Redistricting Data Hub. My focus here today is really to talk about redistricting criteria and how you go about measuring that. So we'll really emphasize the sort of how do you actually take these concepts, which, you know, I think most people sort of agree in theory that those are desirable things for maps to be meeting, but then ultimately you have to translate that into some number, right, into data, and measure that in a map. And so that there's a lot of challenges there, not only in terms of the data that you use, but actually how you go about measuring it. There's many different ways that you can measure these things. So we'll focus first on federal criteria, which apply to all the states, and specifically equal population, as well as the Voting Rights Act. And then I'll just take a brief moment to talk about the 14th Amendment and how that plays into things here. Then we'll switch over to talking about state criteria. So most states have requirements around contiguity and compactness. A lot have requirements around respecting various boundaries, political boundaries, also geography at some times, as well as communities of interest, which has gotten a lot of focus this cycle in particular. And we'll finish up touching on some other criteria that you may have heard about or seen about or been wondering about. And then at the end of this, we'll just sort of revisit Illinois specifically and sort of see, you know, what applies in your state, and then end on the difficult but very intriguing question of how you actually would measure a fair map, given all these criteria, all these requirements that people place on the map drawing process. So feel free to interrupt and ask questions at any time. You can also put questions in the chat, though that is a bit harder for me to monitor in real time. But I will definitely see any questions in the chat at the end, and we'll be sure to get to them then. So without further ado, so as I said, there's essentially two criteria that apply federally to all 50 states. And that applies at the congressional level and the state legislative level, which is mostly what I'm going to be talking about today, actually exclusively what I'm going to be talking about today. They also apply at the local redistricting level for cities, counties, school boards, things of that nature. Local redistricting gets a lot less attention. It's not something that we have supported, generally speaking, up until recently. We're trying to learn more about local redistricting. We're trying to get more local redistricting data, but as an organization that serves all 50 states, and there's 3,100 counties, I don't even know how many cities, I don't even know how many school boards. It's a big task to take on. So just know that the things that I'm talking about especially the federal criteria, apply at all levels. But for this purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing pretty much exclusively on the state legislative and the congressional level. So this was actually not required until the 1960s. Prior to the 1960s, you had states with wildly malapportioned districts, mostly because a lot of states just didn't redistrict. There was a census that was occurring every 10 years, but they just either didn't want to go through the process or they felt there was no need to go through the process. And so they just left things as they were. Also, a lot of states at that time, particularly for their state Senate, essentially apportioned senators according to counties. And so you can imagine even today, if you just gave a senator to every county in Illinois, well, some counties like Cook County have a lot of people in them, and other counties have very few people. And so you just had really, really different district sizes, which unfortunately has the impact of diluting votes, votes of people who are living in these heavily populated districts compared to districts with not too many people. So the Supreme Court got involved. It's a very lengthy story, but in a series of rulings in 1964, they ruled that both congressional and state legislative, both House and Senate districts needed to be equal in population. For congressional, they said it needed to be nearly as practicable. And this has subsequently been interpreted to mean literally one person difference at most. If you have an even number of people in your state and an even number of districts, you should have exactly the same number of people in every single district. If you have an odd number of districts or an odd number of people, then you get to have like one fewer, one less here or there. But essentially, that is the goal. That is the requirement. There are exceptions that are made to this, but the state has to demonstrate a legitimate government interest to deviate from that. So what would be a legitimate government interest? Well, the other redistricting criteria that map makers need to meet. Generally speaking, from what I've seen, most congressional maps are basically this. They're essentially equal or only off by one or very, very few people. When it comes to legislative districts, there's a lot more leeway that's given. So the Supreme Court just said that they needed to be substantially equal, not as nearly as practicable. Again, there had to be more litigation to find out exactly what this means in numerical terms. And the court has said that if you have an overall range of 10% or less, that's probably going to be constitutionally acceptable. Okay, so what is a 10% overall range? Well, imagine that you had a state with 1,000 people in it and 5 districts. So your ideal population in each of those districts would be 200 people, right? 1,000 people divided by 5 is 200 in each district. Well, the deviation of a district is essentially the deviation in that district's population compared to that ideal. So if you had one district with 190 people, that's a 10-person deviation. If you have a district with 210 people, that's also a deviation of 10 people. And then you just turn that into a percentage, right? So like what's 10 people off from 200? That's 5%, okay? So essentially you can have, if that was the situation and you had a state with 1,000 people, 5 districts, an ideal population of 200, in order to be within that 10% overall range, you couldn't have any districts. Essentially, you could have one district that was 210 and one district that was 190, but you couldn't sort of go beyond that range, okay? If you did, then you're gonna have to justify that deviation. It's also the case that just because you have a deviation less than 10%, that may still be unacceptable. It's sort of presumed constitutionally correct, but if somebody were to argue that there was, sort of a bad reason for these deviations and they could be made even lower, right, even less than that, then it's possible that map would also be found in violation of equal population. But generally speaking, that's where states sort of aim for the legislative goals. I also have lots of links in this PowerPoint. Again, so if you don't have a copy, I'm happy to send you one. This just gives you a link to the National Conference of State Legislatures deviation map from 2010, excuse me. We're working on trying to create one for 2020 as well. All right, so equal population. We know what constitutes equal population, but how are we actually measuring this population? Well, the Constitution requires the use of total population for congressional districts. All right, there's actual language in there, not only mandating that the census occurs every 10 years, but that these districts are going to be apportioned according to the whole population. Now, the initial language was a bit more restrictive than that, right? It actually said according to free persons was how districts were going to be allocated. It exempted Native Americans. It also said all other persons, which was essentially code for slaves, counted as 3/5 of a person. So it was not exactly the total population at the outset, but fortunately over time, these things have been amended. And so at this point, yes, it is the entire total population residing in the United States that needs to be counted in the census and that needs to be used in order to allocate these congressional districts, as well as ensure that equal population across districts within a state. In terms of state legislative districts, that is unclear. There have been some cases around this. Could a state, for example, use just the voting age population to ensure that the population is equal across districts, right? People who are 18 and over. Could they use the citizen voting age population? So people who are both United States citizens and 18 and over. The Supreme Court really hasn't definitively said one way or the other. In general, with one big asterisk, states in recent memory have been using total population for state legislative redistricting as well. But as you all know very well, and you may also have seen that this occurred in Oklahoma, that the legislatures in those states did initially draw maps using the American Community Survey data, or what I'll call the ACS data. So the ACS data is collected by the Census Bureau, but it is different from the decennial census, which is, as I said, mandated by the Constitution, mandated to count everybody that resides in the United States. The ACS, one really important difference between the ACS and the decennial census is that the ACS data is a survey and it's based on samples. So they collect very, very large samples, but they are not setting out to try to literally count everybody that's residing in the United States. So they're just estimates. They're estimates of the population. And so both Illinois and Oklahoma I don't know, like they didn't want to wait till August. The census data was delayed. And so they said, we're just going to do it. And the other concern, of course, with using the ACS data is that unlike the decennial census, there is a citizenship question in there. So you may recall that the Trump administration attempted to place a citizenship question on the census. That did not go through. A lot of the groups that we work with were very, very concerned, of course, if that had occurred, that states would attempt to use just the citizen population as opposed to the entire population for redistricting. One would think that the Supreme Court would reject that approach for congressional redistricting, but it's not clear if they would for legislative redistricting. So there's sort of like two issues with using the ACS data there, is that it's not a total count of the whole population, and it also includes some of this other information that could allow some states to draw districts that are based on populations, like subsets of the population, essentially. All right. Oops. There we go. So that's equal population. We'll take an even more difficult one. I would say that this is actually the most complex criteria in order when you're thinking about data and sort of how do you actually measure these things. So also since the 1960s, we've had the Voting Rights Act. It's a federal law, so it applies to all states. There's a lot of language in there, but in terms of redistricting specifically, the important sections are Section 2 and Section 5. So first, Section 2 states, as I've got up here on the slide, that no voting qualification or prerequisite to voting or standard practice or procedure shall be imposed or implied by any state in a manner which results in a denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color. So this gets shorthanded to minority vote dilution. Essentially, Section 2 is prohibiting, among other things, a redistricting plan that would dilute minority votes. This language has been amended a couple times since the 60s. So in 1975, I believe it was, they extended these protections to language minorities. So it's not just race and ethnicity, but also certain language minorities. And then also it does say results in there. That is the most recent version of the language. The initial language in Section 2 just said, I don't actually know if it said intent, but how the courts interpreted it was that you had to demonstrate a state intended to dilute minority votes. And that actually can be quite challenging because, as you all know, states like to be pretty secretive about the redistricting process and not necessarily overly transparent about the reasons why they're doing things or how they're going about doing things. So it's actually very, very difficult in many cases to demonstrate racially discriminatory intent or intent to dilute minority votes. But results, if you can demonstrate that the impact of a map dilutes votes regardless of the intent of the legislature, then now, because they've amended the language, that will be in violation of Section 2. And so for the few folks that were on earlier, and I was mentioning North Carolina, that last cycle they got in trouble for being in violation of Section 2. And so this time around, they said, we didn't look at any race data, so we can't possibly be in violation of Section 2. Well, if the impact of the map is diluting minority votes, then yes, that's still prohibited under Section 2. Section 5, which, as I said, is the other sort of key section that comes up when we talk about redistricting, required pre-clearance from the federal government before enacting any changes. And so again, this applies more broadly to voting practices in general, but you know, I'm here to talk about redistricting. So essentially, if you were a state that required pre-clearance for the federal government or a jurisdiction that required pre-clearance, you had to send your map to the federal government. The Department of Justice or a court would look at it and make a determination as to whether that map created any what's known as retrogression. Retrogression is essentially making a minority group worse off than they were before, right? So an easy shortcut, it's more complicated than this, would be to say, African Americans in Alabama had one minority district, and in this new map they have none, or something like that. So that would be retrogression, especially if the Black population did not decrease or even increased, right? So that would be making that protected minority group worse off, and that would be prohibited under retrogression. Unfortunately, in 2013, there was a case that came before the Supreme Court, Shelby County v. Holder, in which they actually struck down Section 4. So Section 4 contains what's known as the coverage formula. And it essentially determines which jurisdictions are under pre-clearance. So Section 5 is actually technically still in effect, but Section 4, which says, okay, these states, especially a lot of southern states, but also counties out west and up north as well, other cities, again, places with a history of discrimination against racial minorities, that coverage formula is no longer in effect. And so there's no way to determine who needs pre-clearance and who doesn't. And so this is one of the many things that's included in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act bill, which we'll see what happens with that. Okay. Oh, and just also, as I mentioned up here on the slide, there are some states that have VRA-like language included in their state constitutions. So we were just also talking about Florida before this talk got underway. Florida is a state that has essentially a mini Voting Rights Act expressly prohibiting minority vote dilution, as well as prohibiting retrogression in their state constitution. But lots of states do not have that language. And so unfortunately, that protection is not in effect for this cycle for the first time, really, since the 1960s. So section 2 is assessed using what are known as the Jingles criteria. It comes from a case, Thornburg v. Jingles, that was heard in 1986. It's a 3-prong test, right? And prong 1 essentially says if the minority group, the protected minority group, is sufficiently large and geographically compact enough to form a single member district in which they could elect a candidate of choice, then okay, then you've passed sort of prong 1, and we're going to move on to prong 2 and prong 3 to see if you are in fact in violation of section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The reason probably why this is prong 1 is because if the answer is no to this question, if you cannot form a geographically compact district that contains a sufficiently large number of this protected minority group, then there's really no remedy to be had, at least when it comes to redistricting. So I suspect that that's why it's first. It's just like, if the answer is no, then there's no point in continuing on with the analysis. But if the answer is yes, there is a possible remedy to this, then okay, we need to look at the second and third prongs here. When people do this kind of analysis, they typically use the voting age population, right? The 18 and older population, plus 1 person, because you do need 50% plus 1 in order to elect somebody in a very extreme case of of racially polarized voting. But and the reason why is because the focus is on electing candidates. So while our representatives represent all of us, even if you're 16 years old and you can't vote, you still have representatives in government that serve you. And you have somebody then in theory that you can go and talk to, but you can't vote. And so when it gets to this, then typically they do focus on a subset of the population, and specifically the voting age population. That is available from the decennial census. You can get it from the ACS as well, but the decennial census is typically seen as better, since they do collect age information in that. I will say, however, it's not been established as required. And from what I understand, there are some lower courts that have accepted, for example, citizen voting age population in lieu of voting age population for this first prong. Prongs 2 and 3 are kind of easier to treat together. They state that the minority and the majority group must each be politically cohesive, meaning that they vote as a block, and they vote in opposition to each other. And the majority group is regularly defeating the minority group's preferred candidate. Okay, that's essentially what prongs 2 and 3 say. And again, we give this a shorthand of racially polarized voting. How would we actually go about measuring prongs 2 and 3? Well, ideally, we would have individual level data, and we would know exactly which candidate every individual voted for. And we would also know the race of that individual. And then we could see pretty easily, all right, this minority group is overwhelmingly voting for this candidate, and this majority group is overwhelmingly voting for this candidate, and they're regularly electing this person, right, to defeat this minority group's preferred candidate. But as you all, I'm sure, know, that information is not collected, and therefore not publicly available. We do know whether people voted, but we do not know how people voted. That information is not recorded and not available. So that's great for a lot of reasons, but when it comes to racially polarized voting specifically, it's not ideal. It's a huge complicating factor. So what do we know? Well, as I said, we do know whether people voted or not. And in some states, particularly in the South, that voter file information also contains race data. So we at least know sort of how many of a particular racial or ethnic group turned out to vote. We also know how many votes each candidate got, right? That's also publicly available information. What about in states where you don't have racial data on the voter file? So for example, in New York, I believe they do ask for race, but it's not required. And in some states, they don't even ask for race data, right? Well, then you're going to have to basically take a step back from the actual voters in an election and look instead at that ACS data, looking at the voting age population, the pool of eligible voters, or really the citizen voting age population would be the best estimate of sort of the pool of eligible voters in an election. That's not ideal. You really want to know about the people who voted. But again, if that's not doable in a state, then you got to take a step back and just look at the pool of eligible voters. And in either case, whether you're using voter file data with racial information on it, or you're using ACS data on the pool of eligible voters with racial information on it, you're going to have to make inferences about the likely proportion of a racial group that voted for a particular candidate, right? So I may be making it overly complicated here, but the bottom line is that like you really want to know individual level data, the race of a person and who they voted for, but we don't know that. So we can instead look at how many votes candidates got at an aggregate level. And we can also look at the racial composition in that precinct at an aggregate level and try to make, again, sort of educated guesses about the degree of racially polarized voting in a particular area. There's essentially three main methods that analysts use to go about doing this: homogeneous precinct analysis, ecological regression, and ecological inference. In some cases, they'll do all three or two out of the three when they're submitting, an expert report or an amicus briefs or something like that. Homogeneous precinct analysis is essentially where you take precincts with very high proportions of particular racial groups, which may not be too difficult in some places, especially if you're in a very racially segregated city, right? Then it's not too difficult to find sort of, again, if I was using an example in the South, right, precincts that are predominantly African-American, and then precincts that are predominantly white. And then you can obtain the precinct level votes from the county. And so you see, oh gosh, candidate A got 90% of the votes in this precinct that is overwhelmingly white, and candidate B got 90% of the votes in this precinct that is overwhelmingly Black, okay? And so that starts to give you a sense of how much racially polarized voting is happening. Ecological regression and ecological inference just adds some additional nuances to that. The problem with homogeneous precinct analysis is you can only use precincts that are homogeneous, right? If you have a racially diverse precinct, that is much less informative for your analysis. It's much more difficult to understand how individuals are voting in that precinct. So the nice thing about ecological regression is it does allow you to use all precincts, not just these very racially homogeneous ones. And then ecological inference adds in an even additional complexity, which is essentially just using some very basic algebra to figure out this maximum and the minimum number of possible votes that a candidate could have received from a particular racial group. So ecological inference is sort of seen as the gold standard these days, but again, you will see all three used in court. So that all sounds really simple, right? No, it's not. That's a joke. And there are also a ton of unanswered questions around racially polarized voting. How polarized do you need to be in order to be considered racially polarized? I was using an example of like 90% of one group voting for this candidate, 90% versus the other. That probably most courts would look at that and say like, yes, that's racially polarized voting. Again, you see that a lot in like the deep South, like Alabama, Louisiana, maybe Arkansas, I'm not sure about them, Mississippi, right? Where African Americans are like overwhelmingly voting for the Democratic candidate, and whites in these states are overwhelmingly voting for the Republican candidate. So those that's very extreme racially polarized voting. But like, what if it's 70% of a minority group voting for one candidate versus 70% of another group voting for a candidate? Is that racially polarized voting? That's unclear. Which elections do you need to be looking at? If you're alleging that there's racially polarized voting in your county, let's say in Monroe County, we have a county executive who's elected. But we also have our 25th congressional district, which is almost essentially the county. That's not exactly, but it's mostly the county. Could you look at votes in that congressional election to make statements about the county executive race, or vice versa? Can you only look at those elections for that particular office? How far back in time can you go? Can you look at elections from 5 years ago, or have things changed so substantially in that 5 years that that data is no longer relevant or indicative of what's happening on the ground today? How do you know who the candidate of choice is? In some cases, you can sort of safely make guesses and see like, well, there's an African-American candidate and a white candidate, and I've got a jurisdiction with a lot of whites and a lot of African-Americans. And when we do some of this homogeneous precinct analysis, it's very clear who the preferred candidate is, but that may not be the case, right? There are lots of races where there are only white candidates running. So who is the candidate of choice in that case? I will say that primary elections are very, very useful in this context for some of these complexities that I'm referencing, right? Because unfortunately, our parties are increasingly racially polarized as well. Sometimes it's very difficult to disentangle race from partisanship. And so primary elections can be really, really helpful if you're looking at a Democratic primary, for example, and then you see that white Democrats are overwhelmingly voting for the white candidate and the minority group are overwhelmingly voting for a different candidate, for example. And then just to give you one more example of something that's unclear about racially polarized voting, can you combine racial groups for the purpose of this analysis? Can you combine African Americans and Hispanics or not, right? They may have very different voting patterns. So there's really, really a lot of complexities here. And so that's why I wanted to spend a lot of time on it. But in short, if you manage to navigate all of that, and you do in fact demonstrate there's racially polarized voting happening, you do in fact demonstrate that you can form a single member district in which the minority group can elect a candidate of choice, and you also demonstrate that the totality of circumstances indicate the minorities had less opportunity to do this, then this map is going to be found in violation of Section 2, and you're going to have to draw that opportunity district at a minimum. All right, one last note about race in terms of a redistricting criteria. So in the 1990s redistricting cycle, there were two really key things that were different from previous cycles. One is that the Census Bureau released block level data, which is the smallest level of geography at which you can get census data at. So if you've ever been to Manhattan, well, Chicago would work too, right? It's just like a city block is kind of a good mental picture to have of that. So they released that block level data with race information for the very first time. So you had super, super fine grained data that included racial data. Also, the 1990 cycle was really the first time that you had high-speed computers being used for map drawing. And so these two things, like really detailed data and really strong computers, meant that you got some really weird maps, some really bizarre looking maps, because they were able to just do all these things that they couldn't do when they were working on paper and pencil before. And so there was a lot of case law in the 1990s focused on these bizarre districts. And there's one case in particular that came out of North Carolina, Shaw versus Reno. In that case, the legislature had drawn a map in which one congressional district was a majority minority. Pre-clearance was still in effect at this time, so they had to submit their map to the federal government for the okay. And the Department of Justice came back and said, no, we think you can actually draw a second majority minority district. So the legislature did that. And then they were actually sued over it. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. I believe Sandra Day O'Connor actually wrote the ruling in that one, but don't quote me on that. And they said, okay, yes, you do need to consider race, right? Because we have the Voting Rights Act in effect. But you cannot use race as the predominant factor for drawing a map, right? Essentially, that is in violation of the 14th Amendment, which says that you cannot make or enforce any law that's going to deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the law. So, so the practical effect of this ruling is that for folks who don't know a lot of the details about this, it's very confusing. It's not that confusing once you know, but it's, in essence, as I said, you cannot sit down and draw a map with racial data as your primary data point, as your predominant data point. That's going to be in violation of the 14th Amendment. But you also can't ignore race, because you have to ensure that that you're in compliance with the Voting Rights Act. So it's kind of a weird thing, right? But it's doable. You don't start drawing a map by looking only at race, right? That's not going to fly. And you also don't draw a map where you ignore race altogether. That's also probably not going to fly. So these are called shaw claims. They still come up now and again, but as I said, I think it leads to some of the confusion people have around how you're supposed to deal with race when it comes to redistricting. All right, if you're like, how are we going to get through these other criteria? Those are the hardest ones, especially the Voting Rights Act. The state ones are easier by comparison, and especially contiguity. I like contiguity. I've never heard of a single case over contiguity as a redistricting requirement. So as I said, nearly every state requires districts to be contiguous, meaning that you can basically you can follow the boundary of a district with a pencil or your finger and not have to pick up that pencil or finger. If you had sort of just like a weird donut separately from the district out here, that would be a non-contiguous district, and that would not be okay. There are some very minor considerations that come up around this about how do you deal with water, right? Like, Michigan, right, has a lot of water, right? Other states with islands, things like that. And there's also some questions in some states about point contiguity. If a district literally meets at a single point, and that's the only thing that's keeping it contiguous, is that okay or not okay, right? But again, this is generally a straightforward criterion that doesn't come up really much, if at all, in litigation. Compactness is also a requirement that a lot of states have for legislative or congressional redistricting. Typically, they just say they have to be compact in shape. Well, again, this is a great example of like, how do you actually turn compactness into something that we can measure on a map? Well, there are a lot of measures of compactness. Again, there's a link here provided that reviews some of those measures. I've even seen people arguing for subjective measures, basically just looking at it. People look at it and say like, that's compact or that's not compact. The two of the pretty popular ones that you see cited by legislatures or other redistricting bodies, or you see in courts, would be the REAC and the convex hull scores. So you can see here, this blue outline polygon is meant to be the district. So it's the same district in both cases. REAC says basically take the smallest possible circle that encompasses the entirety of that district, and what's the area of those two things? Okay, what's the ratio, what's the ratio of the area of those two things, the district itself, and then the minimum bounding circle is what it's called. Convex hull is very similar, except that you don't have to keep it a unit circle. You can imagine more like a rubber band if you were stretching a rubber band around a district, so that you still have straight lines in every case, but again, it doesn't have to be a unit circle. And then what's the ratio of those two things? And so those are numbers that are pretty straightforward for people to interpret, right? They range from 0 to 1. The larger number you have, the more compact district you have, right? In the extreme, you would, especially for REAC, if you had a district that was a perfect circle and then your minimum bounding circle was the same, and so your ratio is 1, and so that would be a super compact district. But then if you have, a really long skinny district, for example, you would have to have a really large unit circle encompassing it, and so the ratio of those two things is going to be very small. It's going to be close to 0. But there's many other measures that are out there. Length, width, Polsby Popper is one I've heard a lot. Schwartzberg, there's probably some I haven't even heard of. There's many measures of compactness. And so the Supreme Court hasn't said, like this measure is the only measure you can use for compactness or anything like that. But as I said, like REAC, convex hull, and also Polsby Popper are ones that you see pretty commonly being provided by redistricting bodies or being reported on in courts. I do want to make one really important caveat about this, because sort of the funny thing about compactness is it's probably the thing that people focus on the most when they look at districts for the first time. The media really likes to do this as well. We're guilty of it as too. We have lots of weird looking districts on our website, right? And so it's sort of like easy to look at a funky looking district, and by that I mean like a very non-compact district with lots of legs and things going off in different directions, and say that obviously has to be a gerrymandered district. And one of the biggest insights I've had working here is that you really cannot make that claim. You really cannot look at the shape of a district in isolation and make a claim as to whether it's gerrymandered or not. There are lots of very good reasons why a district may look weird or not. For example, trying to meet the Voting Rights Act, trying to ensure equal population. I did not know until I started working here the infamous earmuffs district that you all have in Illinois, right? I believe it just goes along one highway for a section there. There's basically nobody living there. It sort of connects two blobs just by this one line. And that gets shown all the time by the media as an example of a gerrymandered district. Well, it's actually an opportunity district. It's a district that was drawn to try to ensure that Hispanics in that area could elect a candidate of choice. So people like to look at shapes of districts and sort of make claims about them, but you need to know where the people are in that district and who the people are in that district, and also what's happening around that district. So there are lots of good reasons to have non-compact districts. The panhandle of Florida, you're just not going to draw a compact district there. Lots of coastline areas. In fact, it's very, very challenging to draw compact districts. Alaska, their state legislative districts. You have huge mountain ranges that you could maybe draw a compact district, but it would make no sense because you're sort of you're taking one remote community and sort of isolating them off, and because of this mountain range. So there's lots of good reasons for weird looking districts, I guess is the point I want to make here. So a very, very common question is about, oh, yes, sorry, I see a question. Yeah, Patricia, jump on in. Or we can wait if you'd rather wait. Okay, I'll keep going. We'll get back to you. Yeah. So a very, very common criterion that you will encounter as well is respecting boundaries, as well as respecting communities of interest. County lines especially is very common to see, but also smaller jurisdictions. You'll see in some places that states require their legislative districts to be nested, that essentially a Senate district must be composed of 2 or 3 House or Assembly districts, whatever the lower house is called in their state legislature. So that's pretty common. There's also often a requirement around respecting what are known as communities of interest. Communities of interest is a very ambiguous phrase, very difficult to translate into something that's measurable. People have the language that you see in state constitution varies widely. How people define their own communities varies widely. So that's a super complex one. But in either case, you can sort of take the same approach to measuring both respecting political boundaries as well as respecting communities of interest. And that's basically how often they're split. So if you're able to determine like, yes, this is a community of interest that should be kept whole in a district, or yes, this is a county that should be kept whole in a district. Either way, you can sort of take the same approach to measuring how well that was taken into account in a map. The easiest one is to just look at a geographical measure of splitting. So here's my district and here's my county, and it's split twice by districts. Okay, so that's sort of your number, how you're measuring the number of county splits or the number of community of interest splits. But actually it's probably better to again, take into account the people, right? So if you have a county, again, I'll use my own county as an example, Monroe County, Rochester is pretty much smack in the middle at the top. So if you had a split through Monroe County that went right through the heart of Rochester, that has a much greater impact than if you had a split down in the corner of the county, which is much less populated, right? It's impacting far fewer people. So there's also measures that try to take into account the underlying population in a county or a community of interest to try to measure how bad or how many splits are occurring. Again, there's a link provided here. This court has not said definitively like this measure is what you have to use or not. So there's lots floating around there. And I think there could be some litigation around communities of interest this cycle, which would be interesting to see. But yeah, there's a lot of measures there. All right, and then lastly here, just some other criteria that you might encounter. A somewhat popular one is one that prohibits favoring or disfavoring candidates, incumbents, or parties. In each case, with the exception of candidates, I guess mostly for parties, right? But there's questions about how best to go about measuring these things. Some states actually require protecting incumbents, which would, again, a real epiphany for me working here. Typically, they specify that you should avoid pairing incumbents in a single district. In our view, that is incumbent gerrymandering, so that is not a desirable criterion. But lots of states have it. Also, pretty new this cycle. I don't want to say that because Arizona had it in the past, but it's still a relatively new criterion is something around that districts have to be competitive, or they have to be like proportional to the statewide vote, or they have to be fair, right? They have to achieve partisan fairness. These are really interesting because, as I said, they're kind of new, so we haven't seen a lot of states have to grapple with them. Arizona, as I said, is a state that requires their redistricting plan to encourage competitiveness. Missouri implemented new language for their cycle this time that gives a very detailed definition of what they consider competitive districts, and then you have to ensure that you meet that language. Typically, you're looking at election results for any of these things, right? And seeing, again, sort of like, is the way the state votes also representative of the partisan breakdown of the members of these districts, right? So if you have a state that votes 50-50 Republican Democrat, you should see, 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats in your 10 districts, right? And sort of a hypothetical example, that would be what would be considered proportional, right? Or partisan fairness, or one way to measure that. But again, this is like a pretty new thing, and so we'll see what impact that has, if any. I guess one thing I would note about it is that some states, it would be very, very challenging to draw competitive districts, right? There are some states that are very deep blue and very deep red, and I don't know how you would go about drawing competitive districts in some of those states, but other states, battleground states, that is more achievable, and that is kind of where we've seen the language. Like I said, Arizona, Missouri, I guess, but is somewhat competitive, but maybe less so as of late. Okay, so what about Illinois specifically? Well, of course, you have the federal requirements, Equal Population Voting Rights Act, 14th Amendment. I am not aware of any other requirements that you all have for congressional redistricting. For legislative redistricting, your constitution does require that your districts be contiguous, compact, and nested, but that's about it. So you actually are on sort of the end that you find other states where it's just like, gosh, they really don't have a lot of requirements around their map drawing. It makes it very, very easy from the perspective of the legislature to do as they will when they don't have those additional requirements. You did adopt some language that's going to tackle prison gerrymandering, which I actually didn't even get to, but I'm happy to talk more about. And that's going to be in effect for the 2031 cycle, right? So actually going back to thinking about equal population and how we measure that, there's a number of states that require that you reallocate incarcerated people back to their last known address. So Illinois is going to try that for the first time in 2030. Hopefully they learn some lessons from some other states who did it for the first time this year and could have done it better. And then that's how you actually go about, and it's that adjusted or sort of post-allocated, reallocated data set that you use to ensure equal population for. So yeah, so you all don't have a ton of requirements, especially compared to other states like California, where they just got a lot to say. New York is another state where they got a lot to say about the requirements. So, so your constitution is pretty silent in that regard. And I lastly, and I'm happy to stay past noon if you all have time and questions, because I was hoping to reserve a little time at the end here, but former professor, so I talk a lot. I got this very intriguing question that I actually spent a lot of time grappling with, because nobody had really asked us to talk about this in a training or a talk before. You know, as I said, we mostly focus on data and sort of like logistical issues. And so this question of like, how do you actually measure a fair map, or how would you know that you've got a fair map? And certainly one thing that we've all said and learned when we first came to the Data Hub, you know, and if you spend some time working on redistricting, is that fair is very subjective. It's in the eye of the beholder. As you have seen, there are, in other states at least, a lot of criteria that states are having to deal with. In nearly all cases, there is no clear ranking of those criteria. They just say, like, you got to do all these things when you draw a map. They don't say, make sure you do this first, and then make sure you do this, and then make sure you do this. There are a few exceptions to that, but most states just say, like, yeah, you got to have equal population, and you got to have compact districts, and you got to respect communities of interest. Well, for that reason alone, you're going to have to make decisions about how to prioritize those criteria. You're going to have to decide that, like, some take precedence over others. And that already introduces a complicating factor to getting a fair map, right? Some people are going to disagree about how criteria are being prioritized in the map drawing process, unless that is explicitly stated in your constitution or your state statutes. The good news is that I think we have a much better sense and we have known ways of measuring the absence of fairness, sort of the flip side of that coin, which would be gerrymandering. Right? So we don't have good measures of fairness necessarily, but I think we do have a lot of good measures of gerrymandering. So I already discussed racial gerrymandering, maybe more than you all needed to know, and what goes into that and how you actually determine that racial gerrymandering is occurring, right? You're looking at the racially polarized voting, you need election results, you know, you need demographic data, and then you need some good statistical skills, okay? Partisan gerrymandering is something that, unlike racial gerrymandering, is sort of like, there's one way to do it. There's a lot of questions about which data to use and those kinds of things, but it's sort of like you do an RPV analysis. That's how you do it. Partisan gerrymandering, there's many different ways to measure partisan gerrymandering. And unfortunately, the US Supreme Court has really punted on the issue. It's down in 2019. They basically said, like, yeah, partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, but there's no measure that we've seen that is sufficient for us to weigh in on this. And so it's up to the state courts now. And the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court did, in fact, last time throw out a map as an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander under their state constitution. So this is a plausible route. Florida is another place that prohibits partisan gerrymandering in their state constitution. So there's a lot of different measures of that. If you're not familiar with PlanScore, actually, let me see what the link is. Oh, planscore.campaignlegal.org. Let me just actually plop it open for a second for you all. This is pretty nifty. They have all the maps that are being passed. So you'll find Illinois' maps in here. You can also upload your own maps. And essentially it'll give you 4 different scores of partisan gerrymandering. It explains here how you go about measuring those things. The efficiency gap is one that gets a lot of press and attention, so you may have heard about that before. But there are other ways to measure partisan gerrymandering. There's also, and PlanScore does not do this, but a very common method that you'll see as well is using algorithms, using automated redistricting. So computers will generate thousands and thousands and thousands of maps, of different maps. And then you use that distribution of maps you've created to analyze the single map that the state produced. And so if the map that the state produced is like kind of in the middle of the distribution of the 1,000 maps you created, then that suggests that that's like a plausible map, a reasonable map that they would have drawn. But if it's an outlier, if it's like a very rare map, a very unusual map to see, then that's an indication that you have a partisan gerrymander going on. So if you're familiar with the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, they've gotten a lot of press this cycle because they grade maps on a scale from A to F. They just give it a grade. That's what they're doing. Is they're simulating thousands of maps, and then they're comparing the map that the legislature or the commission drew to their distribution of maps. And again, if it's sort of like way out here in the tail of the distribution, then that suggests it's something weird is going on, right? And then incumbent gerrymandering is fortunately a very easy one as long as you can get the data. You just need addresses, right? So most states require, for US Congress, you don't have to live in the district that you represent. That's not required by the Constitution, but nonetheless, it's politically difficult to represent a district you don't live in. So Congress members typically like to live in their district. But state legislative districts and state legislative representatives almost always do have to reside in, according to their state constitution, in that district. And so incumbent gerrymandering is unfortunately something that does not get as the same amount of attention as racial and partisan gerrymandering. It happens a lot. As I said, it was shocking to me to learn how many states literally expressly require incumbent gerrymandering, like don't pair our incumbents. So getting the address data can be a little bit time and work, but it's, in terms of the analysis itself, it's very easy to do. You just look and see, and sometimes you'll see like a straight line of a district, and then it just boop, boots out, and you're like, well, what's that weird little thing? Oh, that's where the incumbent lives. Okay. So yeah, so it's compared to some of these other ones, it's much easier to sort of analyze than some of the others. All right, I'm sorry, I know I'm already at time here, so I'll just, this is my last slide and I'll finish up here. So if you were to think about how you would minimize the chances of gerrymandering occurring, honestly, I wish I had a better answer to this. Trust me, this is something that people contact us about, and I hear the frustration, and trust me, I'm frustrated too. Unfortunately, it's a rare event. It's something that, generally speaking, only happens once every 10 years. The way that we redistrict today in 2021 is very, very different than how it was done in 1971. So we just have like a really small sample size is what I'm trying to say. And when you're trying to study something rigorously and understand like what works and what doesn't, that is a problem, that you just have like a really small sample to work with. And also it's very, very difficult to disentangle all the things that are happening simultaneously in a map. It's really, really challenging to say like this thing made things better or worse, because it's hard to sort of control for all the other things that were happening at the same time. So I want to give that caveat, but that being said, there are some things that sort of seem like they are better at preventing gerrymandering than others. One of those would be commissions, and I mean independent commissions. So people hear independent commissions and they think, oh, independent from politics, independent from the parties. That's not what independent commission means. Independent means independent from the legislature. So there are states that have commissions that are politician commissions, right? Like Ohio has a politician commission. New Jersey has a mix. They've got politicians and citizens. So generally speaking, the farther you can get removed from the people who are eventually going to be representing those districts, the more you can get them out of the process, that seems to be generally better. And that makes a lot of sense just on its face, right? They have a real incentive to draw favorable maps for themselves or for their party. And so, yes, if you can have a truly like independent citizen commission, like you see in Michigan, like you see in California, like you see in Arizona, Colorado had an independent commission for the first time. Those states have produced pretty good maps, all things considering, is what it looks like, okay? Certainly better than a lot of the legislatures, what the legislatures are doing. Criteria, and especially having more criteria and more detailed criteria, may also be something that helps. I've linked here a gentleman, Jonathan Winburn, who's a professor down in Mississippi. He wrote a fantastic book. I plug it to everybody. And of course, I'm blanking on the name of it. So let me just click it open real quick and remind myself. The Realities of Redistricting, that's what it's called. And he takes a real deep look at criteria and how they may impact the redistricting process. in the 2000 cycle. And yeah, I believe the 2000 cycle. And yeah, it's just, his argument is basically just, if you have more criteria, that's more constraints on the people drawing the maps. It's more things that they have to justify publicly that they've paid attention to. And so that helps too, right? Is just more requirements. And the last thing I would say is that we do, I think, have demonstrated evidence that court-appointed special masters can produce good maps. Nate Persily is a Stanford law professor. He drew the maps in Connecticut. His name has been floated in another state, that maybe New Hampshire. Anyway, he might end up drawing the lines in another state as well this cycle. Virginia had a commission that was a mess. It didn't pan out, and it ended up in the courts, and the courts selected Bernard Groffman and Sean Trend, and they drew what most people would say are pretty good maps in Virginia, compared to previous cycles. In New York, our congressional map might get thrown out, and they may appoint a special master for that. And in Ohio, they're still arguing over state legislative maps in Ohio, and the court on round 5 may just say, okay, you guys are not capable of drawing the map, we're going to appoint somebody to do it. My boss, the executive director, RDH, was not a special master, but drew some lines in Florida that ended up being selected by the court in 2015, and are also generally considered a good map. So that was a lot of information to throw at you. I know. I do apologize. For going over as well. And thank you for sticking with me. I'd love to hear any questions you might have, or comments, and so on. Oh, and I see in the chat here, who drew the maps in Illinois? So I have a lot of feelings about states these days, because a big part of my job is finding friends in these states who will give me information. Illinois was a very, very challenging state. I really never was able to identify anybody who would be my friend, so to speak. The legislature, the short answer is the legislature drew the maps in Illinois, and mostly the Democrats. In fact, it's not the only state in which this happened, but it is rare in the sense that it was pretty much just the Democratic Party in the House and the Senate that did the redistricting. They didn't really work with the Republicans at all. I mean, this does happen in other states, but you know, it's their website even was like, you know, Dems, you know, IllinoisDems.org or something like that. They didn't even use like a legislative website for their redistricting information, and nobody ever returned my phone calls or emails or anything like that. So it was a pretty obscure process, unfortunately, in Illinois. Can Illinois have a bipartisan group of elected officials draw the maps? Well, so I don't know. Does anybody know offhand? Do you all have the ability, what's it called? Like ballot initiatives? Do you all have the ability to put things on the ballot through citizen initiative, through signatures? Okay, so that's great. We don't have that in New York. And a lot of the commissions that you see in place got there through citizen initiative, because the legislature, frankly, has very little incentive to give that power away, right? I believe there are some states that have done that voluntarily. But a lot of the states that you see with independent commissions is because there was a citizen-led initiative. They got the signatures, they pushed the issue, they got it on the ballot. People love it. Like nobody, Republicans, Democrats, nobody likes gerrymandering. And so they're often successful ballot initiatives. And again, you have to be careful about, you know, the language there and creating a good commission that's going to work. But it is possible. It is possible to get that. Let's see. So to draw a map in Illinois, you must get elected. Yeah, it is. They essentially have a redistricting committee. Let's see if I can pull it up really quickly. Actually, we're gonna take a quick inside look at. This is my like own little internal database I've put together here. So lots of things. Yeah. So here's the website Yeah, Illinois House Dems. So essentially, this was the where they were keeping information for the House, and this was where they were keeping for the Senate. And so I believe the names of the individuals that were on the committee is hiding in here somewhere. Again, these are not great websites. They're not very useful. Let's see, maybe home here. Yeah, I don't even see the names of the people who are on the committees, but they are, you can't, that is knowable information about like who in the legislature actually served on these redistricting committees. And yeah, and again, currently in Illinois, it's only elected officials in the state legislature who could be drawing that map. Let's see, I have a question about the census info for Joan. That's a great question. Could you elaborate a little bit about, sort of which aspect of the census you'd like me to discuss?
I had missed what you said about we have the census that we take every 10 years, and you mentioned another means of counting.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So yeah, the decennial census is what is required for congressional redistricting, but the Census Bureau, who does the decennial census, collects a lot of other data. So I was talking about one other data set that they collect, which is the American Community Survey, but they have others. They have lots of different surveys that they do with lots of different questions. And so the ACS actually came about because politicians saw how valuable that the decennial census was. And so they kept adding on more questions every 10 years. And they're like, oh, okay, we're going to go do like a giant survey of everybody. Like, well, let's ask them this, let's ask them this, let's ask them this. And it got too long. And the Census Bureau said, look, if you keep making this form longer and longer, people are not going to fill it out. And then you're going to have a bad census. You're going to have a messy census. And so that's actually how the American Community Survey got born, is they said, okay, we'll ask all these questions. We're going to do them separately from the decennial census. We'll do it on a regular basis, like throughout the decade. So the ACS is ongoing all the time. They're collecting data for the ACS every single year. And so they have these huge samples of like 60,000 people. But again, they are just samples. So they're estimates of population and population characteristics, whereas the census, the decennial census, is meant to be a total enumeration. Of course, that is not what actually happens in reality, but that is the goal, is that every single person on April 1st, 2020 told us like where they are and how old they are and some other demographic information about themselves. And so, yeah, so so the ACS, I guess one other thing I would say about the ACS, right? So ACS as opposed to the decennial census is not ideal because it's not a total enumeration of the population. So there's a lot of uncertainty there because you're dealing with estimates. It also contains this other information that could be used that some groups would be very upset about. Like I said, citizenship, which is not on the decennial census. And then the third thing is that it's always a more out of date. So they release ACS data in blocks of 5-year estimates. So on our website right now, we have 2020 ACS data, but it's actually data that was collected in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. So 5 years worth of data. And so what that also means is that the average data point in that 2020 ACS data is from 2018. So it's also old. And populations can shift very quickly. And so that's another reason why using ACS data is not as good as using the decennial census data for redistricting purposes. Let's see here. Great questions. Thank you all so much for weighing in here. Speaking to the incumbent issue, my new district has 2 Democrat incumbents running against each other in the primary. Why did this happen? Yeah, that's a good question. You would think, I knew for sure, once I saw that Illinois was losing a district, just like New York lost a district this year, I thought a Republican's going to lose a seat. And it sounds like it was Adam Kinzinger. Which, well, I won't inject my personal politics into it at all, but so I was not surprised at that, but it is surprising that they have two Democratic incumbents running against each other. One reason may be that they don't like one of the Democrats and they're trying to get rid of them. Just because everybody's in the same party doesn't mean that everybody's on the same page always. That would be probably my biggest guess, because I feel pretty confident that incumbency and incumbent addresses was probably considered during the map making process in Illinois. So it's not like they didn't know. I cannot guarantee that, because I just frankly don't have enough information about how they actually went about doing things, but I would be very, very shocked if it somehow came to be that they had ignored where people lived in the map drawing process. So there is a reason for it. I don't know what the reason is. And my best guess, in the absence of other information, would just be like, they don't like one of them or something like that. Because that's generally something they try to avoid. Connecticut is actually my quote unquote favorite example. You go to the Connecticut redistricting website, you can download an Excel sheet with all the incumbents and their addresses. It's just right on there. They're super transparent about it. They're like, yeah, we're thinking about this. This is an important thing to us. We want to make sure that our people get their districts. So that really blew my mind. Wisconsin had a Citizens Commission. They drew a map. So you might have to give me more information, because from what I understand in Wisconsin, the legislature had primary redistricting responsibility, but the governor had a commission. Governor Evers had a commission. And then the Supreme Court, the Wisconsin Supreme Court, essentially came out and said, we are going to accept maps that exhibit the least change from the last cycle. And as it so happened, the governor's map for, I can't remember if it was the congressional map or the legislative maps. I think it was the congressional map, but I might be wrong about that. Anyway, one of the governor's maps was actually selected by the Wisconsin Supreme Court as better and implementing less change than the legislature's maps. But then they did select the legislature's maps very recently for the other one, for the if it was the governor's map that was the congressional map, then it was the legislature's maps for the legislative ones. And so there could have been also another citizens commission as well, like
no, that's exactly what happened. There was a citizens commission established by the governor. They delivered the map to the governor's office. There was a big parade. It was a big deal. The governor ignored it, put in his map, which subsequently was, as you say, picked by the state, the court. And then the court just reversed itself and said, no, we're going to use the Republican map instead. So my question is, that was just an example of just how much time was wasted there and people's effort. Is there a way to make a ballot initiative binding? So if do we have sample language? I mean, how do we ask them if we ask them to set up a commission, how do we make them not throw it out?
Yeah, well, the key problem there is in the name, that it was an advisory commission. And there are other states that have advisory commissions, and then the legislature or whoever has responsibility can ignore that.
But in Wisconsin, it wasn't a ballot initiative. It was a governor's commission. He made the commission. So you're suggesting, and it looks like from the way Illinois hides everything, that we would need a ballot initiative that would require them to do something, but it wouldn't necessarily require them to accept whatever the independent commission came up with. So I'm wondering, one, is there sample language for anything for this kind of initiative? And two, do you have sample language that makes it binding? Because there's a binding initiative type thing you can do.
Yeah, I am sure I'm pretty confident there's language out there. I would have to go find it, and I definitely will look around.
I think that might be helpful, like nationwide, because I'm sure we're not the only state where we're being held hostage here.
Yeah. And I was exactly, and I didn't quite express that, but I was sort of alluding to that earlier of like, there's good ways to do commissions and there's bad ways. And, so it's like one thing to just say, yeah, we should have a commission and that's going to solve all our problems. Well, you have to set the commission up for success. You need to give them, you just saw how complicated it is, and you want to take 7 random citizens from your state and make them draw a legally compliant map. Okay. They're going to need a lot of training. They're going to need a lot of support, right? There's a lot of things that go into determining that people are truly independent, right? If you've got a commission set up where you've got 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats and 1 independent tiebreaker or something, like how do you actually ensure that person is an independent and not a closet partisan? So there's a lot of things that go into it. And I'm pretty confident that there are groups out there with some model language around commissions. And I will take a dive into that and see what I can send your all way.
Thank you. Because finding you was hard enough. They think, and we really appreciate you joining us and providing this information. This should not be arcane. This is part of our democratic process. This should be something that is transparent. I'm ashamed of Illinois. Wisconsin, for all its flaws, you can see them. They're rather transparent in the mess they're making out of their state. We're keeping it hidden.
Yeah. And it is. It's like, again, like New York, where I live is an equally good example of this, where we passed constitutional language in 2014 to set up a commission. But the language was such that it gave the commission 2 tries to pass a map. And it also didn't set up the commission to really be independent. The state, basically leaders in the Assembly and the Senate got to put people on that commission. And so what ended up happening this cycle, in fact, the League of Women Voters group, I think the statewide League of Women Voters group in New York was initially pushing for this amendment, right, to get the commission. And then once they saw what the final language was going to be and that we were voting on, they actually came out against it. They said, like, this is not going to do it. And they were very prescient because the worst fears were realized. Essentially, the commission never was able to agree on a single set of maps. Both times they submitted 2 sets of maps. There's like, here's the Democratic and then here's the Republican congressional map. And here's the Republican and the congressional Democratic legislative maps. The legislature voted them down both times. And then map making authority went back to the legislature. They held 0 public hearings. They passed the maps in 3 days. It was like getting hit by a tornado. You're like, wait, what happened? I thought we had a commission drawing maps. No, back to the legislature. And like I said, I think there's a decent chance that these maps get thrown out, and they should. So I feel your pain living in a very similar state. Yeah, Cheryl. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, you're still on mute.
There we go. Very early in your presentation, you talked about the legislative versus the state districts. I thought that U.S. Congress, each district had approximately 720,000 population. Is that correct?
That's correct in terms of an average, but
what is the percentage of difference that, can one have 1 million and one have 200,000, or is that way too far off?
What's the standard deviation going to be there?
Yeah. So this is a good question because congressionals are supposed to be like equal, but it's equal within states. So Wyoming, I think your average is pretty close to correct. It's like 720 or 750,000 people on average in a congressional district, but Wyoming has like 600,000 people or something. Like they don't even, but every state gets at least one congressional district. So there you go. And so I've seen maps for the Electoral College where it shows because our votes in the Electoral College are based on our number of senators and our number of representatives, which in turn is based on population. And I've seen maps that show how, because you have congressional districts in some states that are much larger, more populated than congressional districts in other states, that basically your voting power is not equal across the states, right? And so, so there's no requirement that congressional districts be equal nationwide. It's
Oh,
only that they be equal within a particular state.
oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah. So that's a great question. Yeah, because like I said, you see very small states like Wyoming that are underpopulated essentially, and then more populated states that are going to have much larger populations in their congressional districts.
So Kate, so what you're saying is, since it's an average of maybe 720,000, and we have a state that may have $1 million too, to then they get 2 congressmen and it's 600,000 each, instead of 1 congressman and a bit.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
So for instance, in that state with 1.2 million people, they get 2 senators, 2 congressmen, and they are way overrepresented compared to a state with 720,000 as the average.
Yeah. And maybe to give a slightly different example. So, in the census this time in New York, if they had counted just 80 more people in the state of New York in the census, we would not have lost our congressional district.
80 people.
80 people was all we're missing. And like I said, is the census actually counting everybody? No. In fact, they spend the next 3 years, they're doing it right now, evaluating the quality of the census and trying to estimate how badly they undercounted certain populations and how badly they overcounted some populations. This is a known thing with the census, and that they try to measure after the fact. So as a result, because we lost a congressional district, but we were only short of an additional congressional district by 80 people, we have very highly populated congressional districts, right? Then as opposed if we just had 80 people more, and then we'd have a lot smaller, less populated districts.
Then you would have, instead of dividing by 10, you would have divided by
Yep, exactly.
11.
Minnesota is who we're supposed to blame, I hear. Minnesota stole our district. So
People moved to Minnesota? Go figure.
yeah, they're definitely not moving to New York, I guess. I don't know.
Between the mosquitoes and the snow, I don't know.
Exactly. Oh yes, and so about the sample language for the ballot initiative, I'm definitely gonna leave a note for myself and look into that.
Thank you very, very much for a great presentation. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, you all have been lovely, and I mean, I was genuinely excited about doing this talk because this is like right up our alley. And you need people to have a pretty good baseline understanding of redistricting to start getting into the stuff that we talked about today. I mean, that's really getting niche, but I to your point earlier, Vicki, I wish it wasn't, it is complicated, but it is understandable. And that is part of what we try to do, is just to make it like, okay, yes, it's complicated and you're going to have to take some time, but like you can wrap your mind around it. And it is possible to follow the process and to push for,
we're League of Women Voters, but many of our members have hats in other arenas. So your presentation, for instance, you could make this to another group. For instance, I'm thinking of the university women's group. Was that American, whatever, of university women, that American Association? AA
or something. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because some of our members, I think, are also members there. I mean, if we find another organization, okay.
Yeah, definitely put us in connection. And I also want to put in a plug for, so we don't have an advisory data council anymore. We didn't actually know if we were still going to be around at this point in time when it was first set up. But so we created this advisory data council in 2021, mostly consisting of academics, but also some practitioners in redistricting. And one of those members was Dr. Christina Rivers, who teaches at DePaul University. She was fantastic. I don't have as much contact with her anymore since the ADC is no longer in existence, but I know that she is very plugged into redistricting in the state. It was asking us lots of questions about the new language around prison gerrymandering and reallocation and things of that nature. So that's a name that I would definitely pitch to you all to keep an eye
Yeah,
out.
when you send some information on ballot initiative, if you could just put that down so we get the spelling and that of her
Yeah.
name correctly. And I'm an alum, maybe I can reach out to her that way.
Yeah, that would be great. I think one thing I've learned is that the redistricting world is pretty small. And so generally speaking, we're all happy to make new friends. There's frankly not enough people to do the work that's necessary. Yeah.
Well, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like I said, real pleasure. If folks have more questions, I'm happy to stick on a little bit more, or info or help at redistrictingdatahub.org. Those both go to the same places, but let me put that in the chat. I along with a colleague, it's just Peter and me. We run the help desk, and frankly, it is one of my favorite aspects of the job because we make connections like you all. We get great questions, as I said at the beginning. A lot of the research that we've done and the resources that we've ended up putting on the website have started off because somebody asked us about something or made a comment about something that we just had not thought about before. I'm like, oh, like we should know about that. Let's learn about it. And then let's share that with others. So if you do have a question that comes up later or know somebody else that has questions around redistricting, yeah, send them our way. We're always happy to help if we can.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks again. Everybody enjoy the weekend.
Yeah, thank
Sunny
you.
weather.
Thank you
And
so much.
Vicki, one quick question on a different topic. What was the date of that Observer Corps training?
June 9th, it's
June
at 7 p.m. It's 1 hour and you need to pre-register. I think they're going to fix the number of attendees. Go figure. They will send the link. They will send an acknowledgement email and they will send the link to the event about a day before the event.
Okay, so that's June 9th on Zoom, 7 to 8 p.m. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks again, Kate, and everybody.
Yeah,
who
thank you.
participated today.
Yeah, great.
Okay,
Great rest of your weekend.
bye-bye.
Yep, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.